The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street as Samuel Torres pushed open the glass door of Brew and Bean Coffee House. The familiar chime announced his arrival, but instead of the usual warm greeting, he was met with uncomfortable silence. Sam had been coming to this same coffee shop every Tuesday and Thursday for the past 6 months, ever since he'd moved to the small town of Millbrook after his medical discharge from the Army. At 34, Sam carried himself with the quiet dignity that came from 20 years of military service. His graying temples and the slight limp in his left leg told stories of deployments to places most people only saw on the news. 3 tours in Afghanistan had left their mark, not just physically, but emotionally. The doctors had told him that the shrapnel in his leg would always remind him of that October morning when his convoy hit an improvised explosive device outside Kandahar. The coffee shop had become Sam's refuge, a place where he could sit quietly in the corner booth, nurse a black coffee, and work on the memoir he'd been trying to write for months. The words came slowly, each sentence a battle against memories that sometimes felt too heavy to put on paper. But the routine helped. The familiar sounds of the espresso machine, the gentle murmur of morning conversations, and the smell of freshly ground coffee beans created a cocoon of normalcy that his mind desperately needed. This particular Thursday morning felt different, though. As Sam approached the counter, he noticed the usual barista, Maria, wasn't there. Instead, a young man with perfectly styled hair and an expensive watch stood behind the register. His name tag read Tyler, assistant manager. Sam had seen him before, always talking loudly on his phone about business deals and treating the other employees with barely concealed contempt. "What can I get you?" Tyler asked without looking up from his phone, his tone suggesting he was doing Sam a favor by acknowledging his existence. "Just a large black coffee, please," Sam replied politely, reaching for his worn leather wallet. The wallet had been a gift from his late wife, Sarah, before his first deployment. She'd had their initials embossed on the front, and though the leather was now cracked and faded, he couldn't bring himself to replace it. Tyler finally looked up, his eyes scanning Sam's appearance with obvious disdain. Sam was dressed in his usual attire, clean jeans, a simple button-down shirt, and work boots. His clothes weren't expensive, but they were neat and appropriate. What Tyler seemed to focus on was Sam's limp and the small military pin he wore on his shirt collar, a Bronze Star that he rarely talked about but always wore in memory of the men he'd served with who never made it home. "Actually, I'm going to have to ask you to leave," Tyler said, crossing his arms over his chest. His voice was loud enough that several customers turned to look. "This is a family establishment, and we don't want your kind hanging around here making people uncomfortable." Sam blinked, certain he'd misheard. "Excuse me. You heard me. We've had complaints about you loitering here, taking up space without buying much. This isn't a homeless shelter." Tyler's voice grew louder, more aggressive. "And, frankly, some of our customers feel unsafe around people like you." The coffee shop fell silent. Every conversation stopped. Every customer turned to stare. Sam felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment and confusion. In all his months coming here, he'd never had a single negative interaction with anyone. He always bought coffee, sometimes a pastry. He kept to himself, was polite to everyone, and always left a tip even when he could barely afford it. "People like me?" Sam asked quietly, his military training keeping his voice steady despite the humiliation washing over him. "Yeah, you know what I mean," Tyler smirked, emboldened by what he perceived as Sam's weakness. "Disabled veterans, always expecting handouts and special treatment. You people think the world owes you something just because you couldn't hack it in a real job." The words hit Sam like physical blows. He'd faced enemy fire, had watched friends die, had given years of his life in service to his country. He'd never asked for special treatment, never expected anything more than basic human decency. The young man's words weren't just insulting. They were devastating because they echoed the dark thoughts that sometimes crept into Sam's mind during his worst moments. An elderly woman at a corner table gasped audibly. A businessman reading his newspaper lowered it and frowned. But no one spoke up. No one moved to defend him. Sam realized with growing horror that some customers were actually nodding in agreement with Tyler's assessment. "I've never caused any problems here," Sam managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just come for coffee." "Well, find somewhere else to come for coffee," Tyler shot back. "We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone, and I'm refusing you. Now get out before I call the police and have you removed for trespassing." Sam stood there for a moment, processing what was happening. This wasn't the first time he'd encountered prejudice since leaving the military. Finding work had been difficult. Some employers seemed to view his disability as a liability. Others worried about his mental health, as if having PTSD made him dangerous. He'd faced whispered comments and sideways glances before, but never such blatant public humiliation. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the effort of maintaining his composure. Every instinct told him to respond, to defend himself, to explain that he'd earned the right to buy coffee in any establishment he chose. But his military training also taught him when to retreat when a battle couldn't be won. "I understand," Sam said finally, his voice quiet but dignified. He turned toward the door, each step feeling like a mile. Behind him, he could hear Tyler making some crude comment to another customer about cleaning up the neighborhood. As Sam reached for the door handle, he heard the distinctive sound of heavy footsteps behind him. Military footsteps, purposeful, measured, commanding. He paused, his hand on the cool metal of the door handle, and glanced back. A tall figure in an immaculate military uniform had just entered the coffee shop. The man's bearing was unmistakably that of a senior officer, shoulders back, chin up, eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. On his collar, Sam could make out the silver stars that marked him as a general. The officer's gaze swept the room, taking in the scene, the uncomfortable silence, and Sam's obvious distress. "Is there a problem here, soldier?" the general asked, his voice carrying the authority that comes from decades of command. General Marcus Washington had served in the United States Army for 38 years. He'd commanded troops in 3 different wars, earned more medals than he could count, and had the respect of soldiers and civilians alike. At 57, he was still an imposing figure, 6 feet 4 inches of pure military bearing, with steel gray hair and eyes that had seen too much, but never lost their compassion for those who served under him. He'd stopped at Brew and been on his way to a Veterans Affairs meeting at the nearby community center. As someone who dedicated his post-retirement years to advocating for veteran services, he made it his business to visit local establishments and ensure they were veteran-friendly. What he'd walked into, however, was something that made his blood boil. Sam turned around, recognizing the insignia immediately. Years of military protocol kicked in automatically. "No, sir, no problem at all," he replied, straightening despite his exhaustion. The last thing he wanted was to cause trouble for a fellow service member, especially one of such high rank. But General Washington had excellent hearing and even better instincts. He'd caught the tail end of Tyler's tirade, had seen the customers' reactions, and could read the situation as clearly as a military briefing. The young veteran standing before him was obviously distressed, and the smirking assistant manager behind the counter was practically radiating smugness. "Son," the general said, addressing Sam but speaking loud enough for everyone to hear, "I asked if there was a problem, and I'd appreciate an honest answer." Sam hesitated. Military protocol demanded honesty when a superior officer asked a direct question, but civilian life had taught him that speaking up often made things worse. He glanced back at Tyler, who was no longer smirking. The presence of a general had clearly rattled the young man, though he was trying to maintain his bravado. "The assistant manager asked me to leave, sir," Sam said finally. "He said they don't serve my kind here." General Washington's expression didn't change, but something cold and dangerous flickered in his eyes. He'd spent decades learning to control his temper, but disrespect toward his soldiers, active duty or veteran, was something that still triggered his protective instincts. "I see," the general said calmly, walking past Sam toward the counter. His boots clicked against the tile floor with military precision, and conversations throughout the coffee shop ceased entirely. "And you are?" Tyler stammered for a moment, clearly intimidated by the general's presence, but trying to maintain his authority. "I'm Tyler Morrison, assistant manager, and I was just explaining to this gentleman that we have the right to refuse service to anyone we choose." "Indeed you do," General Washington replied, his voice perfectly controlled. "And I'm curious about the criteria you use for such decisions. What exactly did this soldier do that warranted removal from your establishment?" The word soldier hung in the air like a challenge. Tyler's face reddened as he realized his mistake. "Well, we've had complaints about him loitering, taking up space without buying much. And some customers feel uncomfortable around people with his condition." "His condition?" The general's voice remained level, but everyone in the coffee shop could sense the danger beneath the calm surface. "Could you be more specific about what condition you're referring to?" Tyler was trapped, and he knew it. In front of a room full of witnesses and a military officer whose very presence commanded respect, his earlier bravado was evaporating quickly. "You know, his disability. Some customers worry about unpredictable behavior from people with PTSD." The silence that followed was deafening. General Washington took a slow, deliberate breath, his hands clasped behind his back in a classic military pose. When he spoke, his voice carried across the entire coffee shop. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly. You've denied service to a United States military veteran because of injuries he sustained while serving his country. You've made assumptions about his mental health and character based solely on his appearance and the fact that he walks with a limp. Is that an accurate summary of your position?" That's not. I mean," Tyler stumbled over his words, looking around the coffee shop for support that wasn't coming. Several customers were now looking embarrassed, ashamed of their earlier silence or agreement. General Washington turned to address the entire coffee shop, his command voice filling every corner of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to meet Sergeant Samuel Torres. Sam served 3 tours of duty in Afghanistan with the 82nd Airborne Division. He was awarded the Bronze Star for heroism in action when he single-handedly held off enemy forces to protect wounded soldiers until medical evacuation could arrive." Sam's face flushed with embarrassment. He'd never wanted his service record discussed publicly, had never wanted to be seen as seeking sympathy or special treatment. "The limp this young man complained about," the general continued, "came from shrapnel wounds Sam received when his convoy was attacked by an improvised explosive device. He spent 8 months in military hospitals and rehabilitation centers learning to walk again. The PTSD he so casually dismissed is a common and treatable condition affecting thousands of our nation's heroes who witnessed and endured things most of us can't imagine." The general's gaze swept the room, making eye contact with every customer present. Sergeant Torres wasn't asking for special treatment. He wasn't seeking handouts or sympathy. He was trying to buy a cup of coffee in an establishment that benefits from the freedoms he fought to protect. Tyler's face had gone from red to pale white. Several customers were now looking distinctly uncomfortable, and more than a few were pulling out their phones, not to call the police, but to record what was becoming a powerful lesson in respect and dignity. "Now," General Washington said, turning back to Tyler, "I believe you owe this soldier an apology. And then you're going to serve him the best cup of coffee this establishment has to offer on the house, with a sincere expression of gratitude for his service." "But, sir, I don't have the authority to give away free coffee," Tyler protested weakly. "Then I suggest you find someone who does," the general replied sharply, "because I can guarantee you that this situation is about to become a much bigger problem than one free cup of coffee." As if summoned by the tension in the air, a middle-aged woman emerged from the back office. Her name tag identified her as Jennifer Hayes, store manager. She'd clearly been listening to the exchange and looked mortified by what she'd heard. "General, I am so deeply sorry," she began, approaching quickly. "Mr. Morrison was acting completely outside of our company policy and our personal values. Please allow me to apologize to your friend and make this right." General Washington nodded approvingly, but didn't step aside. This wasn't just about getting Sam his coffee anymore. This had become a teachable moment, and he intended to see it through completely. Jennifer Hayes had managed the Brew and Bean for 7 years, and in all that time, she'd never faced a situation quite like this. She'd hired Tyler 3 months ago against her better judgment, influenced by his father's position on the city council and his mother's involvement in local charities. Now, she was witnessing the worst possible outcome of that decision. "Sergeant Torres," she said, approaching Sam directly and extending her hand. "My name is Jennifer Hayes, and I'm the manager here. I want to personally apologize for the inexcusable treatment you've received in my establishment. This does not represent our values or our policy in any way." Sam shook her hand hesitantly, still processing everything that had happened in the past few minutes. The general's intervention had been unexpected and overwhelming. He wasn't used to being defended so publicly or having his service record announced to a room full of strangers. "Mr. Morrison," Jennifer said, turning to Tyler with barely controlled anger, "please step into my office immediately. Your employment here is terminated effective immediately. And before you even think about arguing, I should mention that everything you've said and done here has been recorded by multiple customers. I suggest you leave quietly and consider this a learning experience." Tyler's mouth fell open. "You can't fire me. My father won't stand for this. He'll have your franchise license pulled." "Your father," General Washington interjected smoothly, "happens to be Councilman Morrison, if I'm not mistaken. I had the pleasure of meeting him last month at a Veterans Affairs Committee meeting. I'm quite certain he'll be very interested to learn how his son has been representing the family name." The color drained completely from Tyler's face. The general was right. His father took his political reputation seriously, and publicly humiliating a war veteran would be political suicide in a community that prided itself on supporting the military. "Clean out your locker and leave," Jennifer ordered. "Security cameras recorded everything, so don't even think about claiming wrongful termination. And Tyler, if you ever speak about any of our employees or customers the way you spoke about Sergeant Torres today, you'll find yourself facing more than just unemployment." As Tyler slunk toward the back office to collect his belongings, Jennifer turned her attention back to Sam and the general. "Sergeant Torres, please sit wherever you'd like. Everything today is on the house, and I'd be honored if you'd allow us to serve you." "That's very kind," Sam said quietly, "but really you don't need to." "Yes, we do," Jennifer interrupted gently. "And not because we have to, but because we want to. This is your coffee shop, too, and you should feel welcome here." General Washington smiled approvingly. "That's exactly the right attitude, Miss Hayes. And I think I speak for everyone here when I say we'd all like to learn more about making veterans feel welcome in our community." What happened next surprised everyone, including Sam. An elderly woman from the corner table approached them slowly, using a walking cane for support. She was probably in her 80s, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Excuse me," she said softly, addressing Sam directly. "I'm Margaret Chen. My late husband served in Vietnam, and I want to apologize for not speaking up when that young man was being so cruel to you. I was a coward, and I'm ashamed of my silence." Sam started to protest, but she held up a gentle hand. "No, dear, let me finish. My Henry faced similar treatment when he came home from his war. People didn't understand then, either. I should have known better, and I should have done better. Would you allow an old woman to buy your coffee today as a small way of saying thank you for your service?" Before Sam could respond, a businessman in an expensive suit approached. "I'd like to second that sentiment," he said. "I'm David Rodriguez, and I own the accounting firm down the street. I heard what the general said about your service record, and I'm embarrassed by how this community has treated you. If you're looking for work, I could use someone with your attention to detail and reliability in my office." Sam was overwhelmed. In the span of 20 minutes, he'd gone from being humiliated and rejected to being defended by a general, offered a job, and surrounded by people expressing genuine respect for his service. I don't know what to say," Sam admitted, his voice thick with emotion. You don't need to say anything, General Washington replied. Just accept the kindness being offered, and know that there are far more good people in this world than there are Tyler Morrisons. Maria, the regular barista, had arrived for her shift during the commotion and quickly understood what had happened. She approached with tears in her eyes. Sam, I am so sorry this happened to you. Tyler has been horrible to everyone since he started, but what he did today was unforgivable. You're one of our nicest customers. As word spread through the coffee shop, more customers began approaching Sam. Some simply wanted to shake his hand and thank him for his service. Others shared their own stories. A teacher whose brother had served in Iraq, a nurse who worked with veterans at the local hospital, a retired police officer who understood the challenges of transitioning back to civilian life. Jennifer returned from her office, having completed Tyler's termination paperwork. I've also called our district manager, she announced to the group. I want to make sure this incident is properly documented and that we implement additional training for all our employees about serving veterans and people with disabilities. General Washington nodded approvingly. That's an excellent step, Ms. Hayes. But I'd like to suggest something even more meaningful. What if Brew and Bean became an officially designated veteran-friendly establishment? There are programs that help businesses learn how to better serve our veteran community. I would love that, Jennifer replied immediately. What would that involve? Well, the general said, warming to the topic, it starts with sensitivity training for all employees. Understanding PTSD, recognizing the signs of someone who might be struggling, learning how to communicate respectfully with people who have invisible disabilities. It also means creating an environment where veterans feel truly welcome, not just tolerated. Sam listened to this conversation with growing amazement. What had started as one of the worst experiences of his civilian life was transforming into something positive and meaningful. There's more we could do, Margaret Shun added thoughtfully. What if we started a weekly Veterans Coffee Hour? A time when local veterans could gather, share stories, support each other, and job networking, David Rodriguez suggested. I'll bet there are other business owners in town who would be happy to hire qualified veterans if they knew how to connect with them. The energy in the coffee shop was becoming electric with possibilities. General Washington could see the spark of community engagement that he'd witnessed in dozens of other towns where veterans and civilians had found ways to bridge their differences and build mutual support. Sergeant Torres, the general said, "What do you think about all these ideas? After all, you're the one who experienced the problem firsthand." Sam looked around the coffee shop, taking in the faces of people who an hour ago had been strangers and who now were offering friendship, employment, and community. The transformation was almost too much to believe. Sam found himself at the center of attention in a way that felt completely foreign to him. For months, he'd been virtually invisible in this town, just another face in the crowd, someone people glanced at but didn't really see. Now, suddenly, everyone wanted to hear his thoughts, his ideas, his story. I think, Sam said slowly, choosing his words carefully, that what happened here today shows how easy it is for people to make assumptions about each other. Tyler saw my limp and jumped to conclusions. But honestly, there have been times when I've made similar assumptions about other people too. The honesty of his response surprised everyone, including himself. What I mean is, maybe this isn't just about veterans. Maybe it's about how we treat anyone who seems different or who might be struggling. General Washington smiled broadly. This was exactly the kind of thoughtful leadership he'd hoped to see from the younger veteran. That's an excellent point, Sergeant. Compassion isn't selective. It either exists in a community or it doesn't. Jennifer seized on the idea immediately. What if we expand the concept? Not just veteran-friendly, but truly inclusive for everyone who might feel unwelcome somewhere else. People with disabilities, elderly folks who might feel intimidated by younger crowds, anyone who's having a hard time. I love that idea, Margaret Chin said enthusiastically. You know, I sometimes avoid certain places because I feel like my age makes me unwelcome. It would be wonderful to know there are businesses that actually want diverse customers. As the group continued brainstorming, Sam noticed something remarkable happening. The artificial barriers that usually existed between strangers in public spaces were dissolving. People were sharing personal stories, offering genuine help, and forming real connections. Tyler's cruelty had inadvertently created something beautiful. David Rodriguez pulled out his business card and handed it to Sam. I meant what I said about the job offer. I need someone detail-oriented for accounts receivable and client management. The work might seem boring compared to military service, but it's honest work that pays well, and we have excellent health benefits. I appreciate that more than you know, Sam replied, accepting the card. I've been looking for work for months. Most employers see my disability as a liability. Their loss, David said firmly. Military training creates some of the best employees in the world, disciplined, reliable, capable of working under pressure. Any business owner who doesn't recognize that is missing out on exceptional talent. General Washington overheard this exchange and stepped closer. That brings up another important point. We need to educate employers about the value veterans bring to civilian workplaces. There are tax incentives available for hiring veterans, and there are support programs to help with the transition. What kind of support programs? Jennifer asked, her business owner instincts recognizing an opportunity to do good while also benefiting her establishment. Well, there are federal programs that help with job training, workplace accommodations for disabilities, and even partial wage subsidies during the initial training period, the general explained. The problem is that most small business owners don't know these programs exist. Sam found himself speaking up again, his confidence growing with each positive interaction. Maybe we could create some kind of resource center? Not necessarily a physical location, but information that businesses and veterans could access easily. That's brilliant, Margaret exclaimed. My late husband was involved with the veterans of foreign wars before he passed. They have meeting space at the community center that's barely used anymore. It could be perfect for workshops, job fairs, information sessions. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of someone Sam hadn't expected to see. Through the coffee shop's front window, he could see a news van pulling up outside. Jennifer noticed it too and looked concerned. I hope this doesn't turn into a media circus, she murmured. General Washington chuckled. Ms. Hayes, good news travels fast in small communities. And, frankly, positive stories about veterans deserve media attention. Too often, the only stories people hear are negative ones. A young reporter entered the coffee shop with a cameraman behind her. She looked around, clearly trying to assess the situation and identify the key players. Sam instinctively wanted to retreat, but found himself gently blocked by the group of new friends surrounding him. Are you Sergeant Torres? The reporter asked, approaching with professional courtesy. I'm Sarah Martinez from Channel 7 News. We received a tip about an incident here involving a veteran being mistreated and then a remarkable response from the community. Would you be willing to share your story? Sam looked around at the faces surrounding him. General Washington, Jennifer, Margaret, David, and several other customers who had stayed to be part of the conversation. They all nodded encouragingly. I suppose, Sam said hesitantly, but I want to be clear that this story isn't about me being a victim. It's about how quickly people can come together to fix a problem when they choose to care. The reporter smiled. That's exactly the kind of story we love to tell. What followed was an impromptu interview that captured not just the initial incident, but the remarkable transformation that had occurred in its aftermath. General Washington spoke eloquently about the challenges veterans face and the importance of community support. Jennifer discussed her plans to make the coffee shop more inclusive. Margaret, David, and the other customers shared their perspectives on building bridges between different groups in the community. But it was Sam's words that would end up being quoted most widely. Today I learned that one person's prejudice has less power than a community's kindness. What Tyler did hurt, but what everyone else chose to do afterward gave me hope. As the interview concluded, the reporter asked about the concrete steps the group planned to take. Jennifer had already compiled an impressive list. Mandatory sensitivity training for all employees, partnership with local veterans organizations, a weekly veterans coffee hour, job networking events, and an application to become an officially certified veteran-friendly business. General Washington added his commitment to help coordinate with other businesses in town, creating a network of veteran-friendly establishments. Margaret volunteered to help organize the social events and reach out to other community groups. David promised to talk to his business colleagues about hiring opportunities and to sponsor job training programs. And what about Tyler Morrison? The reporter asked. Have there been any consequences for his actions? Jennifer's expression became serious. Mr. Morrison's employment was terminated immediately. But more importantly, this incident has prompted us to examine our hiring and training practices to ensure this never happens again. I actually hope Tyler learns from this, Sam interjected, surprising everyone. He's young, and young people can change. Maybe someday he'll understand that the person he tried to humiliate today was willing to put his life on the line to protect Tyler's right to be wrong. The grace in Sam's response left the reporter momentarily speechless. This wasn't the angry veteran or the triumphant victory story she'd expected to find. This was something deeper, a lesson in forgiveness, community, and the power of choosing hope over bitterness. As the news crew packed up their equipment, the group in the coffee shop realized that their impromptu gathering had created something lasting. They'd moved beyond responding to one incident and had begun planning a genuine transformation of how their community treated its most vulnerable members. 6 months later, the Brew and Bean Coffee House looked almost exactly the same, but felt completely different. Sam Torres pushed open the familiar glass door, greeted by the warm smile of Maria behind the counter, and a chorus of friendly hellos from the morning regulars. The usual, Sam? Maria called out as he approached. You know it, Sam replied, pulling out his wallet. But Maria waved him away. It's Veterans Day, remember? All veterans drink free today. Company policy. Sam smiled and shook his head. Maria, I appreciate the gesture, but you can't give away free coffee to every veteran every Veterans Day. You'll go broke. Are you kidding? Jennifer Hayes emerged from the back office, grinning broadly. Since we became certified as a veteran-friendly business, our sales have increased by 40%. Turns out that when you treat people with respect and dignity, word gets around. The transformation had been remarkable. What started as a response to one ugly incident had grown into something that transformed the entire community. The weekly Veterans Coffee Hour now drew participants from 3 neighboring towns. The job networking events had resulted in dozens of successful placements, and the sensitivity training program Jennifer had implemented had been adopted by 12 other businesses in the area. Sam settled into his usual corner booth, but unlike months ago when he'd sit alone working on his memoir, today he was joined by familiar faces. Margaret Shun arrived precisely at 9:30, as she had every Tuesday and Thursday for the past 4 months. David Rodriguez stopped by between client meetings to discuss the scholarship fund his firm had established for veterans pursuing business degrees. How's the new job working out? Margaret asked, settling into the booth with her tea and morning pastry. Better than I could have imagined, Sam replied honestly. David's accounting firm had been the perfect fit. The work was challenging but manageable. His colleagues respected his military precision and attention to detail, and the steady income had allowed him to move into a better apartment and even start planning for the future. But the job was only part of the change in his life. The memoir he'd been struggling to write for months had finally found its voice after the coffee shop incident. The story wasn't just about his military service anymore. It was about homecoming, community, and the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change. General Washington called yesterday, Sam mentioned casually. The book is being considered for publication by a military veterans press. They think it could help other veterans who are struggling with similar transitions. That's wonderful, Margaret exclaimed. Henry would have been so proud to see how you've turned your pain into something that helps others. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of someone Sam still found surprising. Tyler Morrison approached the booth hesitantly, looking nervous but determined. Sam, could I speak with you for a moment? 6 months ago, Sam might have expected this encounter to be confrontational, but Tyler looked different, humbled, more mature, and genuinely remorseful. Of course, Sam replied. gesturing to an empty chair. Tyler sat down awkwardly, clearly struggling with what he wanted to say. I know this is probably too little and too late, but I wanted to apologize. Not just for what I did that day, but for the person I was. Losing this job was actually the best thing that ever happened to me. Sam raised an eyebrow, curious about where this was going. I had to move back in with my parents, Tyler continued. My dad was furious, not because I got fired, but because of why I got fired. He made me volunteer at the Veterans Center for 3 months as punishment. I learned how wrong I was about everything. Tyler pulled out a small business card and placed it on the table. I'm enrolled in the community college now, studying social work. I want to work with veterans someday to help people instead of hurting them. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that your example, the way you handled what I did to you, it changed my life. Sam picked up the card, reading Tyler's name under the heading Student Intern, Veteran Transition Services. The transformation seemed almost impossible, but the sincerity in Tyler's voice was unmistakable. Everyone deserves a second chance, Sam said quietly. The question is what we do with it. Tyler nodded, clearly emotional. I'm trying to earn mine every day. Thank you for not giving up on the idea that people can change. After Tyler left, Margaret patted Sam's hand gently. That was very gracious of you. You know, Sam reflected, when I first came home, I was angry about a lot of things. Angry about my injuries, angry about how hard it was to find work, angry about feeling invisible. What Tyler did that day just brought all that anger to the surface. David nodded, understanding. But instead of staying angry, you chose to build something better. We all did, Sam corrected. That's what made the difference. As if summoned by their conversation, General Washington appeared at their table. Even in retirement, he maintained his military bearing, but his visits to the coffee shop had become more social than professional. Mind if I join you? The general asked, already settling into an empty chair. I have some news I think you'll all want to hear. He pulled out an official-looking document. The state has approved our application for a grant to expand the veteran-friendly business program statewide. Brew and Bean will serve as the model location, and Sam's story will be featured in the training materials. Sam felt overwhelmed again, just as he had 6 months ago, but this time with gratitude rather than humiliation. I never imagined that one bad day could lead to something this big. That's the thing about communities, General Washington observed. They're only as strong as their willingness to stand up for their most vulnerable members. What happened here proved that Millbrook has that strength. Jennifer approached the table carrying a framed certificate. This just arrived, she announced proudly. Official recognition from the Department of Veterans Affairs as a Gold Star veteran-friendly business. She hung the certificate on the wall near Sam's usual booth, right next to a photo from the news story that had started it all. The photo showed the unlikely group of people who had gathered around Sam that transformative morning. General Washington, Margaret, David, Jennifer, and several other customers, all united in their determination to right a wrong and build something better. You know what the best part is? Sam said, looking around the bustling coffee shop filled with veterans, civilians, elderly customers, young families, and people from all walks of life. Tyler was wrong that day when he said this was a family establishment. He just didn't understand what family really means. Margaret smiled broadly. Family means making room for everyone, especially those who need it most. As Sam sipped his coffee and watched the diverse crowd of customers chatting, laughing, and supporting each other, he reflected on how much had changed. The limp in his leg would always be there, and the memories of war would always be part of him. But so would the memory of this place, these people, and the moment when a community chose kindness over cruelty. His phone buzzed with a text message from his publisher. Memoir approved for publication. Title suggestion: When Communities Care, A Veteran's Journey Home. What do you think? Sam smiled and typed back. Perfect. Outside the coffee shop windows, Millbrook looked the same as it always had. But inside the Brew and Bean and in the hearts and minds of everyone who had been part of the transformation, everything was different. One act of prejudice had been met with countless acts of kindness. creating ripples of change that would continue long after the last cup of coffee was served. Sam opened his laptop and began typing the final chapter of his memoir, starting with the words that had become his guiding principle. Sometimes the worst moments in our lives become the foundation for the best things that follow. The choice is always ours to make.